there is a line of division. It's called the Green Line, which marks the armistice line that was arrived at in an armistice in 1949 at the conclusion of fighting in the 1948-9 war between the Jordanian and Israeli armies. That line, which lasted 19 years, did divide East and West Jerusalem, and the old city was on the Jordanian side of that line. The Jordanians occupied the whole of the old city, including, for example, the Jewish quarter of the old city. It should be added, though, if we say that, if we point that out, that Jordanian occupation of the old city had no greater, but also no lesser, legitimacy than Israeli occupation. And that's an important point, because people, after all, do point to history as providing legitimation. There was no greater legitimacy for the Jordanian occupation of East Jerusalem than there was for the Israeli occupation of West Jerusalem, or for the Israeli occupation of East Jerusalem since 1967, because Jerusalem as a whole, and not only the old city, and not only the municipal area of Jerusalem, but a larger area stretching as far as Bethlehem, far to the south of Jerusalem, several miles to the south of Jerusalem, a large area around Jerusalem, had been designated by the United Nations to be what was called, using an old Latin legal term, a corpus separatum, a separate area, a separate body, which would be part neither of a Jewish state, nor of an Arab state, nor of a Palestinian state, under the 1947 partition arrangements for Palestine that the United Nations decreed, but would be a separate area which would remain under United Nations rule for a period of at least 10 years. But at the end of that 10 years, there would be a referendum among the population, and the population would be given an opportunity to decide whether they wanted to be part of the Jewish state or of the Palestinian state. I should add that the area was cunningly delineated in such a way as to include a population which was almost exactly half Jewish and half Arab. So the result of the referendum, if it had ever taken place, would have been very narrow, whichever way it had ever gone, and also very dubious, since it would have depended entirely on questions of birth rate and immigration. Now, the United Nations never succeeded in asserting its control over Jerusalem and establishing this quasi-state, free city of Jerusalem, a kind of international city. But in its failure to establish control there, it left a kind of political vacuum. So Jerusalem is in a very different legal state from the rest of the West Bank. So when we say that the Green Line, or the Armistice Line, went through the middle of the city, yes, that is historically correct, but that does not necessarily mean that East Jerusalem can be considered as having the same status in international law as the rest of what we now call the West Bank. And that's a very important point, I think, that should be understood. Since 1967, of course, Israel has tried to enforce its sovereignty in the whole of the city. Now, in the early decades of the Israeli control of East Jerusalem, this was confined to two main things. One was the redevelopment of the Jewish quarter in the Old City, and the other was the development of a ring of new housing developments around East Jerusalem. Since the 1980s, so in the past 2 decades, there has been an effort by religio-nationalist elements, supported by parts of the right wing of the Israeli political establishment, including Ariel Sharon, to take symbolic actions to assert Jewish control over mainly Arab-populated parts of Jerusalem. By way of explanation, I should just say that Jerusalem is a highly segregated city when it comes to the distribution of the population. This is nothing new. It has always been the case, and it is the case in historically in many Middle Eastern cities. So Jerusalem is not particularly unique there, that there were different quarters for different ethnic and religious groups. Many cities in the Middle East, though, have changed as minorities have been forced out. But Jerusalem, which remains a city with many different groups in it, has remained highly segregated in the sense that not just that Jews and Arabs live in separate areas, but also that the Armenians have their area, and within the population, different groups have different areas. So that, for example, among Jews, there are ultra-Orthodox Jewish areas, there are moderately Orthodox Jewish areas, and there are secular Jewish areas, etc., etc. Now, the effort from the 1980s by these religious nationalist groups was to take symbolic action to reclaim, as they see it, Jewish-owned property, that's to say property that had perhaps been owned or occupied by Jews before 1948, in areas of the old city other than the Jewish quarter. Because before 1948, too, as today, the quarters were not absolutely homogeneous or hermetically sealed, so that some Jews lived in areas of the old city other than the Jewish quarter, a few. There were some Christians and some Christian churches, as there are today, in areas other than the Christian quarter, etc., etc. So this effort has also had a physical aspect in that the effort has been made to either reclaim or buy up property in areas of the old city, and indeed areas beyond the walls of the old city, and populate or repopulate them with Jewish incomers. The old city of Jerusalem, which is the area of less than 1 square mile within the walls of the city that were put up in the reign of the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century. These walls, which are virtually intact. This area is divided into 4 quarters. A Jewish quarter, a Muslim quarter, a Christian quarter, and an Armenian quarter. The Armenians, of course, are Christians, but their quarter is separate from the quarter of other Christians. The quarters are not marked by any physical boundary on the ground. So if you want to know which quarter you're in, you have to refer to a map or ask somebody. The quarters are not all the same size. The largest quarter by far, which is almost as big as the other 3 put together, is the Muslim quarter. It is also the most populous quarter. None of the quarters has an absolutely homogeneous population. The quarter that is closest to being homogeneous is the Jewish quarter, which, as of 2000, and it hasn't changed all that much since then, had 1,800 Jews, 500 Muslims, and 0 Christians. The Armenian quarter at that time had 700 Jews, 500 Muslims, and 1,200 Christians, of whom the great majority are Armenian Christians. The Christian quarter had 3,900 Christians, many of whom are ecclesiastics, Greek Orthodox or Latin, that's to say Roman Catholics in the main, although there are some others too. And finally, the Muslim quarter had 400 Jews, 1,400 Christians, and 21,900 Muslims. So you see, first of all, that all 4 quarters have representatives of other faiths within them. Secondly, you'll gather from those figures that the Muslim quarter is far more populous than all the others, and that Muslims are far more populous in the old city than others. In fact, out of the total population in the old city, which in the year 2000 was 33,700, the Muslims accounted for 23,700. So they constitute a majority, an absolute majority by far, of the population of the old city. And indeed, that has remained so in 2009, although the population altogether has grown. The Muslims who live in the old city are very poor. They are indeed among the poorest part of the Muslim population of Jerusalem. Housing conditions in the old city, but particularly in the Muslim area, are wrong. The crowding, particularly in the Muslim quarter, is very great. The Jewish quarter has largely been rebuilt since the 1967 war. Between 1949 and 1967, when Jordan was an occupation of the eastern part of the city, including the whole of the old city, the Jewish quarter had been abandoned by its Jewish population who had fled in the course of the 1948 war. Some Muslim squatters occupied the Jewish homes in the Jewish quarter, but when the city was conquered by Israel in 1967, the eastern part of the city, including the old city, the Jewish quarter was largely rebuilt, redeveloped, much in the style of what it had been, but the Jewish quarter too, before 1948, had been occupied by the poorest segments of the Jewish population, and also by ultra-Orthodox Jews. And those who settled in the old city Jewish quarter after 1967 are in the main Orthodox Jews. Not all ultra-Orthodox, but in the main Orthodox Jews. So that the Jewish quarter has a religious atmosphere, which not all parts of Western Jewish Jerusalem have. Some have and some haven't. But the Jewish quarter of the Old City is mainly occupied by Orthodox Jews. The Armenian quarter is remarkable in one respect, and that is that the Armenians are actually in a minority in the Armenian quarter. As I mentioned, only 1,200 out of 2,400, but probably they are now an actual minority in the Armenian quarter. Armenians have lived in Jerusalem for many centuries, all clustered around their cathedral in the Armenian quarter. Many of them are craftsmen, and there are some traditional occupations that Armenians have held in Jerusalem. They live mainly in the Armenian quarter, and they have links with the Armenian diaspora in other parts of the Middle East, including Lebanon, as with the Armenian homeland. The Christian quarter is again unique in that it is really dominated by great Christian institutions, in particular the Latin Patriarchate and the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate. The Greek Orthodox Patriarchate lives up to its name. It is run by Greeks, and indeed it is a kind of Greek ecclesiastical colony in the Holy Land. The laity, the Orthodox laity in the Holy Land are Arabs, but the higher ranks of the ecclesiastical hierarchy are Greeks, and there is considerable internal conflict within the Orthodox Church as between the Arab laity and the Greek Orthodox hierarchy. There are also conflicts within the hierarchy, but that's another matter. The Christian quarter also holds large numbers of other smaller sects. You will find there Syrian Orthodox, Syrian Catholic, Copts from Egypt, Ethiopian Orthodox, Ethiopian Catholic, etc., etc. But the largest sects are the Orthodox and the Latins, and there is a historic rivalry and indeed enmity between them that finds its most acute expression in the struggle over the rights of the respective churches in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. After long decades of fighting between monks and even between armies, Russia and France, and Britain in the Crimean War in the mid-19th century, the Christian churches agreed not to agree over who owns the Church of the Holy Sepulchre or the Church of the Nativity, but agreed nevertheless that everything that had been done in the past by way of who could go where and who could do what in terms of processions on holy days or prayers in particular chapels, everything that had been done in the past would remain the basis for the future. That is the basis on which an agreement not to agree has brought peace most of the time between the Christian sects in these highly contested Christian holy places. The area in front of the Western Wall was cleared immediately after the Israelis conquered East Jerusalem in 1967. Until then, in front of the Western Wall, there was only a very narrow passageway in which people or donkeys could pass. But on the other side from the wall there was a slum area known as the Maghrebi quarter, and that area was razed to the ground after the 1967 war. People were moved out involuntarily, expelled in other words, from their homes and moved elsewhere. The area then was opened up to accommodate the vast throngs of Jewish pilgrims. The Western Wall is a contested holy site. Nearly all holy sites, at least a very large number of them in Jerusalem, are contested. The Temple Mount itself, on which the Western Wall abuts, is a Muslim holy site, but in recent years that has been contested by some nationalist Jews who even dream of rebuilding the temple there. The Western Wall is claimed by Muslims as also being a Muslim holy site. It is called Al-Buraq. Buraq was the miraculous steed on which the Prophet Muhammad, according to Muslim tradition, rode in a single night from Arabia to Jerusalem. He tethered Al-Buraq, allegedly, at the Western Wall, and then ascended the next door mount, which Jews call the Temple Mount, and from there rose to the seventh heaven, then came down again and rode back to Arabia, all in one night. Now, that is the basis on which there is a Muslim claim to the Western Wall as a Muslim holy site. Now, it should be said that historically this claim is quite recent. Since 1967, the Western Wall has been turned into a kind of synagogue. It wasn't that before 1967. It was a place of pilgrimage. It was a place where individual Jews prayed, but there were no services of an organized kind that took place there. It was forbidden in that period, which is said under British rule between 1917 and 48, to bring benches there or to bring the other fixed appurtenances for a synagogue to the Western Wall. So people prayed there individually. And by the way, until the 20th century, men and women's areas of prayer at the Western Wall were not divided, because people just went and prayed as individuals next to the wall. It's called in religious parlance in Hebrew a mechitza, a dividing partition to separate the women's prayer area from the men's prayer area, as in all Orthodox synagogues. The custom is that when Jews go and pray at the wall, they often will put a little paper containing a request or prayer to God in one of the crevices between the great stones of the wall. And that is a very common custom, which even some secular Jews who visit Jerusalem these days, tourists, will indulge in. From time to time, these become so full, these crevices, that the waste paper has to be gathered up and carted away. The wall abuts onto the Temple Mount, but it is far below it. And the Temple Mount itself, the Jews call it the Temple Mount, the Muslims call it the Noble Sanctuary, Al-Haram al-Sharif, the Noble Sanctuary. It contains the mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is one of the most prominent landmarks in Jerusalem, and the Dome of the Rock. sometimes called the Mosque of Omar, but it is not a mosque, it is a shrine. Within that is the rock which marks the spot allegedly where Abraham sacrificed Isaac. One thing that many Jews don't understand, or many non-Muslims don't understand, is that the Temple Mount is not an area on which there are Muslim holy places. The Temple Mount as a whole is a Muslim holy place, all parts of it. And that misunderstanding is what provides a basis for a tiny minority of extremists to claim that it would be no great sacrifice for Muslims if they allowed a synagogue to be established on part of the Temple Mount, which of course Muslims see, not without some justification, as an attempt to create a foothold which could then lead to an attempt to rebuild the temple. Now, most religious Jews regard with a mixture of abhorrence and absurdity the idea of rebuilding the temple. Nobody knows exactly where the Holy of Holies was located. There are some enthusiasts who try to work out on the basis of the biblical measurements that are given of Solomon's temple in the Bible, try to work out exactly where it was, but it's impossible to know. And that's important because it is on that basis that many Orthodox Jews, including some important Orthodox Jewish authorities, such as one of the former chief rabbis of Israel, have issued judgments stating that Jews must not set foot on any part of the Temple Mount because they might be stepping on the Holy of Holies, which is an area where only the high priest might set foot in ancient times, and for that matter, in their eyes today. And it's on that basis that shortly after the 1967 war, one of the two chief rabbis, there are two chief rabbis in Israel, one of them ordered the putting up of a sign at the entrance to the Temple Mount stating that Jews must not enter because they might step on the Holy of Holies. So far as the Western Wall is concerned, it is outside the area, the compound of the Muslim holy places, but it is immediately below it. And in times of tension, it has been the case since the 1920s that occasionally over-enthusiastic, shall we say, Muslim defenders of the holy places, as they see it, have taken to dropping things, or even throwing things, stones, bricks, donkey excrement, from the top, above the Western Wall, down onto Jews praying below. And this, needless to say, has given rise to incidents, often to violence between Muslims and Jews and riots. And the close contiguity of the great Muslim holy place in Jerusalem, Al-Haram al-Sharif, and the great Jewish holy place, the Western Wall, is one of the great enduring problems in Jerusalem. It's not unique, but of course, in the case of the Jews and Muslims, it has been given a special color in recent decades by the political conflict, the nationalist conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. In 2000, when negotiations took place between the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority at Camp David under the auspices of President Clinton, and then for a few months afterwards elsewhere. There was discussion of Jerusalem, and the Israeli government at that time did manifest readiness to accept Palestinian sovereignty in most Arab inhabited parts of Jerusalem, that's to say, East Jerusalem. So far as the Old City was concerned, there was discussion at Camp David of an arrangement whereby the Palestinians would gain control of the Muslim quarter and of the Christian quarter. The Israelis would retain control of the Jewish quarter, and there was some discussion about the Armenian quarter. That wasn't a major issue. The Palestinians manifested a readiness under such arrangements to have the Western Wall be under Israeli control. There was no agreement on the issue of who should control the Temple Mount. It should be said that the Temple Mount, for practical purposes, since 1967, has always remained under the day-to-day control of the Muslim religious authorities, the Waqf. There is a small Israeli police post on the Temple Mount, but except at times of extreme tension, Israeli security forces have abstained from entering that area. So for practical purposes, Muslims have retained control of the Temple Mount throughout that period. Now, there was no agreement at Camp David about what might happen on the Temple Mount itself. There were various suggestions put forward. Of course, no agreement was reached on the larger political issues at Camp David, nor has agreement been reached since. The present Israeli government remains strongly committed to upholding Israeli sovereignty in the whole of Jerusalem. Its predecessor, headed by another right-wing Prime Minister, Prime Minister Olmert, was rather more open to the idea of Palestinian sovereignty in Arab parts of Jerusalem. Mr. Olmert made it very clear that he was prepared to advance in that direction, even though when he was mayor of the city in earlier times, he had been strongly opposed to that. So he has moved. But the present government of Benjamin Netanyahu was strongly opposed, at least rhetorically at the moment, to any redivision of Jerusalem. But there is a large part of the Israeli political spectrum which would be ready to contemplate some form of redivision along the lines that were discussed and indeed came close to being agreed at Camp David. And when people ask, well, what about the Temple Mount? Surely it's impossible to reach agreement on that. My answer to that is, yes, I believe it is impossible to reach agreement on that in the sense of a treaty which would lay down who is sovereign there. I believe, nevertheless, that this need not be a total obstacle to any agreement on a political settlement on Jerusalem. And I believe something similar could work on the Temple Mount. And the reason that I say I believe that is not because I have a great faith in the reasonableness of people who, I admit, can often be very unreasonable on both sides on these highly charged religious issues. The reason I say I believe that is that I have a basis for that belief in the status quo that has existed since 1967. Because since 1967, in spite of the fact that Israel controls the whole of Jerusalem, and in spite of the fact that Israel claims sovereignty over the whole of Jerusalem, Israel has not, in fact, when you go there on the ground, taken over the Muslim holy places. It has respected the authority of the Muslim Waqf on the Temple Mount. Now, I'm not saying that the behavior of the Israeli authorities in relation to the Muslim holy places has been perfect by any means. They have restricted access at many times to the holy places, and they've done other things at certain times, sometimes quite inflammatory, like Mr. Sharon's visit there on the 28th of September 2000. But by and large, that status quo has been respected by Israel since 2000. And I think some sort of basis for the future arising from that status quo may provide a formula for the future whereby Israel and Palestine, without agreeing on who is sovereign there, may in practical day-to-day terms be able to coexist.